Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Churches, CEO of AAUW. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for an AAUW webinar called Equitable Recovery, Transforming Business Beyond COVID-19. It's all the more important of a conversation we're having tonight and this afternoon following the CDC's announcements just in the past few days. We'll wait for just another minute here before we formally start, but I can just say thank you so much for joining us, because we know that the pandemic, for which we are crawling and scraping our way out of and feel finally that the light is on the horizon, but we all know that it's exacerbated deep-rooted inequities in our communities, our business practices, the workplace itself, educational systems, essentially all parts of our society. And it's really disempowered the most vulnerable workers and business owners in our communities. So I think because of what we're already seeing just since the CDC made their announcements last Thursday, as well as the remarks by the CDC director yesterday on the morning news shows on Sunday, we're already starting to see private sector businesses announcing a full return to work without a phased approach. And I have to say that as I've spoken with both of our terrific panelists tonight, I've been overly optimistic that what we have gone through as part of humanity, and certainly in this nation over the last 14 or 15 months, that we had our eyes wide open and would build back better workplaces with more flexibility, more understanding about the emotional and well-being of our employees. And we'll talk a lot about that today so that we don't rush too quickly to recreate the old normal, but can create environments where people can not only survive, but thrive in the workforce. So that is going to include a lot of issues around safety and health, around caregiving, and a host of other inequities that I know our panelists will bring up tonight as well. And with that, I also wish to thank the University of California, Berkeley Haas School for their tremendous support for our webinar series. And I do want to first and foremost introduce our two terrific panelists, and then we'll kick it off tonight. So we have Malcolm Glenn, who's joined us today, and Malcolm is actually joining us on the road, is kind enough to be finding a space to join us in Flagstaff, Arizona right now, on the road to be joining us and sharing his expertise. Malcolm is a writer, speaker, organizational consultant, and public policy and communications specialist. He's currently the director of public affairs at Better, which is a home ownership platform, a terrific one. I was just on it recently for my own home. And he's also a fellow at the New America Foundation for the Future of Land and Housing program. Critically important as we are together as a nation talking so much more about the systemic racial inequities in our nation, in every part of our society. And we're so grateful for his work there. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for Workforce Inclusion. He's an advisor to the Health Action Alliance, a group that encourages the business community to really promote COVID-19 vaccines among our most underrepresented communities. Before joining Better and his other policy roles, Malcolm was previously the head of global policy for accessibility and underserved communities at Uber. And before that, he was an executive communications manager for Google's chief financial officer. Malcolm is a dear friend. He serves on a lot of boards as well and is such an important and powerful voice on these topics. So thank you, Malcolm, for joining us. I'd also like to welcome Genevieve McFarland-Smith. Genevieve is the Associate Director at the Berkeley Haas Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership. There, Genevieve directs and executes on strategy to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in industry, while also fostering equity fluency, something she'll talk about, as a key leadership skill for future business leaders. For more than a decade, Genevieve has been conducting research and directly advising Fortune 500 companies on gender equity and women's economic empowerment. Prior to joining Haas, she worked for the International Center for Research on Women, where she conducted research. So she's, like us, is still based in facts and data and research to really getting to stronger outcomes and better changes so we can all move forward. She also previously worked with the UN High-Level Panel on Women's Economic Empowerment and the UN Foundation's Clean Cooking Alliance. So I am so grateful, Genevieve, to you for joining us as well tonight. I know this is going to be a truly powerful conversation. To kick things off, Genevieve, I'm hoping that we all know and we've all read about, we've all witnessed and seen how many inequities have been exacerbated during the pandemic, how so many people, the 70% of us in the US that are able to work from home, and the 30% of whom we now deem essential workers who've been keeping us fed, keeping us safe, and putting our public health at the forefront. But we know it truly has exacerbated the economic inequities and workplace flows for working women and BIPOC humans. So, what are some of the specific findings that went into the development of the Transforming Business Beyond COVID-19 playbook that you all worked on to address these inequities?
Sure. Thanks, Kimberly, and it's wonderful to be here with Malcolm, and great to have all of you here. So we developed a playbook around equity fluent recovery and specifically transforming business beyond COVID-19. And in this playbook, we evaluated how Fortune 100 companies as of last June had responded to the initial stages of the pandemic. And the clear majority of efforts taken by companies were philanthropic giving and donations or CSR activities. We also saw a variety of changes for worker experience, like temporary changes to pay time off for sick leave and caretaking. But overall, most of these early month efforts were very much so in response to the pandemic and reactive, which makes sense to some extent, but we're missing addressing the underlying kind of power structures and issues that are causing these immense inequities to begin with. And that kind of obvious and immense gap really spurred the premise of our playbook around how can we address the root issues in business and in our economy that are perpetuating inequality and injustice, as opposed to band-aiding issues. And again, not to say that's not important, but it's also not enough. And more is needed to avoid returning to the normal that existed pre-COVID, which is one that there were great inequities that existed for people of color and women and other folks in our society. So while relief is important, it doesn't on its own address how businesses are perpetuating inequities in the workplace and in the products and services they develop. And really, companies have the opportunity, and we think more importantly, the responsibility to look internally and critically examine how their own practices and policies are contributing to and amplifying inequities during COVID-19. And we really see this as a moment for visionary leaders for that critical self-reflection, but also to explore, enable, and catalyze business as a force to advance an equitable and inclusive society, and really leveraging this once-in-a-generation opportunity to do so. So I'll share a bit more about kind of our playbook and some of the findings that we found in that.
Right. And you can actually, if you want to go ahead and share some of that.
Oh, perfect.
And I'll just say too, I think, and this is, we'll pull Malcolm into this too, because I think part of one of my worries here is that so many of us are just waiting for policymakers to pass what we think will ensure greater equity. But I think what you're really saying here too is the power in every sector, nonprofit, for-profit, quasi-governmental and governmental, to really ask the what, why, when, how, and why is it we thought we needed to be in the office 5 days a week, and why is it we didn't instill better flexibility? We don't need to wait for policymakers for a lot of that. And I think that's where I'm hoping you'll get to with the playbook too, to kind of tell us a little bit more. So if you could start there, and then I'll kick it over to Malcolm, that would be great.
Absolutely. And can you see my screen?
Unfortunately, we just see your notes right now, not your power.
Oh. Okay, let's see here. How's that?
Yep, we got it. Great.
Okay, perfect. Great. Well, yeah, so I'll share a little bit more about the playbook. So just as some context setting, and thank you, Kimberly, for doing this a little bit more, but I'll just share some more background before diving into the different plays. So, as everyone is well aware, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on individuals, communities, and economies globally, and really exposed staggering inequality in the US. COVID has deeply impacted women and workers of color. People of color and women are more likely to be in close contact with COVID-infected individuals in the workplace because of the industries in which they work, their higher likelihood of being considered essential workers, and their lack of flexible work arrangements, as you spoke to, Kimberly, all of which has really restricted their ability to telework during COVID-19. And people of color and women are more likely to suffer job losses during COVID. And we have really seen this play out. Just in the United States, more than 2.5 million women left the workforce since the pandemic began. That's about 1.8 million for men. And it didn't even take a full year before working women lost more than 3 decades of labor force gains. In particular, women of color are affected. And outside the US, the picture is even more concerning. Recently, the World Economic Forum said that the pandemic will set women back a generation. People of color and women are also less likely to be making a living wage and less likely to have access to healthcare and job benefits, including paid sick leave and childcare, with women, particularly Latina and Black women, shouldering large childcare and elder care responsibilities. And lastly, people of color and women are also more likely to own businesses that will close. So this impact to workers really creates more dire consequences for business and society at large as well, which in turn further exacerbates the risks that workers face to their health and livelihoods. And as I mentioned before, the pandemic, while devastating, offers a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address this inequality and to rebuild business and the workplace in disruptive and courageous ways. And now is really the time to be thinking about this and planning for this. And to help facilitate this, we at the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership, or EGAL for short, developed this playbook for business leaders to transform business priorities, policies, and approaches beyond COVID, and really focusing on the experience, needs, and realities of Black, brown, and female workers in the US. So, in the media and in corporate communications, equitable recovery is often focused on returning to the previous normal and the workplace that already existed. But it's clear that what we need is not to return to normal, actually not at all. In fact, we are talking about returning to a new normal that seeks to integrate equity not just into the return itself, but into the very fabric of how businesses and organizations operate. And we call this equity fluent recovery. So Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, really captures the spirit of equity fluent recovery well in this statement, where he says, corporate America can no longer get away with token responses to systemic problems. It's going to take a systemic response to sufficiently address this crisis that has been decades in the making. So I'm just going to introduce some of the different plays that we developed through our kind of research process and really asking what are the actions and strategies needed to create more equity and inclusion in society moving forward in this new normal. And we have identified 12 plays for business leaders and organizations for this equity fluent recovery. And the first really starts with the courage to change yourself as a leader. This play is really recognizing that leadership is a series of active choices, and pursuing an equitable recovery won't happen without leaders who choose to be bold, to use their power to tear down barriers and drive change, and leaders who prioritize purpose, inclusion, vulnerability, and compassion. And the next 3 plays are kind of extensions of some of the actions that we already institute by corporations during COVID-19. So I mentioned before, we did analysis on kind of Fortune 100 companies of the Fortune 100 and what kind of actions they were taking. And these 3 plays are really kind of extending some of these initial actions corporations were taking. So they're focusing on critical job benefits that are needed for workers of color and female workers today, were needed before, and will be needed beyond the pandemic, including paid leave, living wage, and worker relief funds. And the following 5 plays begin to create the necessary environment and resources to reach a recovery that accelerates racial and gender equity well into the future. So these include creating pathways for worker growth, supporting worker voice, committing to enabling caretaking, investing in small business partners, and embedding equity and inclusion in products and services. And the final 3 plays are really about systemic changes to leadership and power structures that exist at organizations and companies. And they create exponential opportunities for people of color and women. So these are around kind of pushing for long-term executive pay structures, stopping stock buybacks, and instituting co-determination models. While all the plays are important, I wanted to call out a couple of key plays that are directly linked to creating an equitable workforce for women, especially women of color. So as we mentioned, paid leave is critical for workers to manage caretaking and sickness. And organizations have various opportunities, such as additional paid leave and embedding flexibility in paid leave policies, especially during COVID, and can also structure care benefits to be more comprehensive and more inclusive of the many types of care leave needed. Time to care for elderly family members, in addition to children, and also chosen families. And again, understanding that every support system is unique and may not conform to traditional nuclear family structures. There have been various companies kind of taking the lead here. We did see that Google offered 14 weeks of additional paid leave to full-time employees during COVID, as parents kind of faced, of course, increasing responsibilities at home and due to school closures. Google also established a fund to provide its contractors with paid sick leave during COVID as well. And related to living wage, women make up the vast majority of low-income workers. Jobs held by people of color and women are more likely to be hourly, part-time, lower quality, and also largely in the service industry. So these jobs are less likely to pay a living wage, which means not enough money for a worker to adequately meet their basic needs. And women of color disproportionately occupy jobs with lower pay. We've seen different companies moving to living wage versus using minimum wage. So Ben & Jerry's, which is a brand of Unilever, pays workers based on a living wage calculation for Vermont, which is about $18 last year. And then building new models to support caretaking. We cannot emphasize enough the importance of caretaking for children, for elders, and chosen family. So long, the kind of economic value of caretaking has been unrecognized, but it's so critical. And this is, in the US context, is really important to think about, especially as we are one of 2 countries globally that doesn't offer paid maternity leave, and caretaking is something that is really not prioritized, supported kind of at various levels of our society. And I think, the pandemic has really exposed the immense amount of caretaking that many folks take on, especially mothers, given gender norms and expectations for women in caretaking. Women have been leaving the workforce in droves and not returning, and there are very clear linkages to caretaking responsibilities and burdens. And lastly, I'll just touch on related to investing in small business partners. People of color and women are more likely to own businesses that will or have closed related to COVID-19. And there are opportunities for organizations to invest in strategic relationships with minority-owned and women-owned businesses, and committing to increasing procurement from them in supply chain. So we've seen Sephora and West Elm, for example, take a 15% pledge where they've committed 15% of their shelf space to Black-owned businesses. So we're seeing some movement here, and of course, more is needed. So these are just some examples and highlights of the plays. The playbook, you can find, there's a tiny URL at the bottom of the page to access it. You can also find more about some of the research conducted analyzing those responses from Fortune 100 companies in the earlier days of the pandemic, and some lessons that we can learn from history and past crises, as well as more on each of the plays. So look forward to continuing the conversation in the panel, and I'll stop sharing my screen from here.
Thanks so much, Genevieve. That was really comprehensive and a great way of showing where business practices can be refined to really ensure that we're living our DEI statements, not just throwing out hashtags and nice social media postings, which is where I am today. And I'll be honest, in preparing for this, a week or so ago, I think my optimism level was a little higher than it is today. And some of that is maybe my own anxiety after, let's face it, a 14 months that's been unlike any of us ever expected in our professional lives, and a lot of eye-opening in a lot of areas that we at AAUW have been working on. Actually, all 3 of us have been working on for a long, long time. But I'd be curious, Malcolm, as you hear Genevieve kind of go through some of these very practical plays that every sector in the workplace can get into. We know, and we both have seen over the past year, how many organizations, companies, municipal to federal government, and frankly, globally, have been focused on putting out their own DEI policies, their vision statements, but they don't always translate to real practices. So, as you have worked both in the private sector and in kind of the quasi policy government sector, I'd love to get a sense from you as to how you're thinking about what businesses need to do to really hold themselves accountable and get beyond just a few cute phrases, but really getting into the core of some of the things that Genevieve is talking about in the playbook.
Well, it's a great question, Kim. And first, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to join you all today. Kim, it's always a pleasure to chat with you about these issues. And Genevieve, thank you for giving us the space to have this conversation. The work that you all are doing at Eagle is really, really phenomenal. And I really love the way that you talked about this notion of tying inclusion into products and services, because there is a real gap that I have seen over the course of my career between the way in which, as Kim said, companies talk about this work and how they really tie it into what their external output is. I think a lot of companies, too many, quite frankly, think about diversity and inclusion as the sort of end unto itself. And in reality, DEI work is really just a means to an end. And the end is, how do we create solutions out in the real world that really improve outcomes for people that a company's services or product or service are serving? So I think that's one point, is really taking into account this notion of inclusive design and making sure that we're not thinking about DEI as only something that looks at what our workplace looks like, but in fact is very much focused on the external output in communities. And to really kind of dig into your point, Kim, there has always been a really, I think, frustrating problem of what I call performative inclusivity in the business community. And I think if we're being honest, we saw it really reach a peak almost a year ago in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the extensive, of course, worldwide racial justice protest. And I think we understand to some degree the reasons why. It felt like a little bit of a perfect storm of things. There was this, sort of visceral reaction that people had to watching, quite frankly, a man being murdered on video on the heels of the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor in the midst of a pandemic, when everyone, particularly at that stage, was really desperate for some sort of release. And particularly, again, in the context of a pandemic where the virus is disproportionately killing people of color. And so a lot of companies, it was great that they felt compelled to make those statements a year ago, statements that they had never made before that. But what I'm curious about is, particularly as that moment has died down, there hasn't been as much interrogation from customers, from the media, from advocates about whether they were squaring those statements with their actions. And I think it's going to be interesting to look at what the next couple of weeks look like as we reach the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder. I think the questions are going to come back up. Have these companies worked to improve representation in their own companies? Are they working on making their products more equitable than they were a year ago? What's become of a lot of the really big financial commitments that they've made to racial justice organizations and nonprofits? I'm a little bit dubious about what the answer is going to be to some of those questions. And I think the truth is, if we look at, if we leave those questions entirely to businesses to answer themselves, we'd all be disappointed. And all of the things that we want companies to do have a cost in terms of either time or money or both. And many businesses are just so short-sighted and so unfortunately focused on generating those short-term profits that they're not going to necessarily hold themselves accountable. But I do think employees within those companies have a huge role to play. People who are committed to equity, even if the company writ large is not, can push their leadership to be better. The advocates externally who put pressure on companies to make their actions match their words, they can push companies to be better. Because for me, the truth is that most companies are just so inherently risk averse. And I say this both from afar and also from my own personal experience. And so they don't want to do things any differently that they've done them before, particularly if based on how they just judge success, those things have worked in the past. And so it's only when the risk of inaction becomes greater than action that we can really have what I hope is real accountability for making sure that the values that companies espouse aren't just lip service. And I'll just end by saying, you mentioned policymakers. I think policymakers do have a really huge role to play, whether it's regulatory action or oftentimes just the mere threat of more engagement from the policy realm. Companies, particularly those who are in highly regulated spaces, are oftentimes most open to change that they've oftentimes previously opposed when there's a chance that it will be required of them under law. So the short version is Businesses are not going to hold themselves accountable. It's up to the employees within those companies, the advocates who are doing the on the ground work, and the policymakers who have a responsibility to really educate themselves on these issues to make sure that businesses are not just talking about it, but are living it in their actions as well.
Boy, beautifully put, Malcolm. And I'd say, just to add on to your point on the power of employees and employee voices, whether they're individual, collective through ESGs or BRGs. But I'd also add to that customers. It's a little bit like we're all reading and participating much more in ESG investing as we think about where the nation's endowments are in our nonprofits, and are they investing around their diversity, equity, and inclusion, their missions and their values in the same way, and are they expecting the companies in which, or the mutual funds in which they're invested, to be representative of those mission, vision, and values. So I'd add to that, I think it's employees and customers to demand, because I'm really glad you said that. I mean, it was an incredible time in this nation, in this city where I reside, and around the nation, and frankly around the world, following George Floyd's horrific video of his murder, that it stunned the entire planet and started to move people towards action. I think where I am, as you use the word dubious, and I tend to agree with you, that as we look ahead here, just since the weekend, there were 2 Fortune 100 companies that came out and said, kind of, we're getting back to work quickly, back to the old ways. And I'm also really curious about this for BIPOC humans in the workplace, also generational changes and gender equity. Maybe Genevieve, you can touch on this a bit too, because we know, as we think about this, if we somehow decide to flip a switch and just go back to the old normal, all of that work of what we've learned, of how we've seen why, how, and to whom this economy and the downturn in the economy has hurt those. If we don't build back with a different flexibility, certainly around paid leave and caretaking, 2 big issues that we are advocating for daily at AAUW. But I think it's important as we look at this, as we think about what businesses can do, which you've got those wonderful practical ways that businesses can improve their practices in your playbook, and what policymakers can do, as Malcolm said, but also what individuals, employees, and customers can do. But just to put a point on this, we know that more than half of all the jobs lost during the pandemic were lost by women, with the highest rates among Black, Asian, and Hispanic women. And this is actually the first time we've seen that Asian women downturn in employment as well. And we know it, hashtag caretaking, we know that's a big issue around this. So we're right now in this. I mean, this conversation could not be more poignant to the times we're living in, because of the announcements from the CDC last week. As the focus of businesses moves from survival back to recovery, right now, if there are a couple of things, low-hanging fruit, that you would hope that sectors, industries, and organizations and companies would focus on as they're looking at their policies and practices, are there a couple low-hanging ones, Genevieve, that you would think that they should be harnessing right away to make sure that they're more equitable in their workplace policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've kind of touched on some of them too as you were talking, Kim. And so in terms of the low-hanging fruit, I would say to get started, I think rushing back to everyone working 5 days in an office, 9 to 5, that clearly will continue to have a very large impact, especially on women, given that a lot of the same caretaking issues, not everywhere are schools back in full force. I was just talking to my colleague. She has 2 children, one of whom is at school for 3 hours a day, and the other one is not in school, is much younger. So she's still doing, over a year later, she still is doing quite a bit of caretaking every day. And so especially, given gender norms and expectations within our society around caretaking for women, that's not going to be going away. So if companies and organizations start returning to that, standard model that existed before, we will continue to see these large, numbers of women leaving the workplace without the kind of supports needed. So maintaining flexibility, I think, is a really important one that I would put in the more low-hanging fruit area. Doing more to support around caretaking and supporting the paid leave opportunities for caretaking, is another one that, again, some more low-hanging fruit opportunities. I think that, again, while it's important to take advantage of some of these low-hanging fruit, I think we can't lose this moment as well to go after some of the higher up fruits, so to speak, and really think about, yes, let's take advantage of, or let's get some of these lower hanging fruits to support a more equitable, inclusive society, but let's not pass this moment as well to make some of these bigger shifts that are needed. And I loved Malcolm's points around thinking about the different ways that companies and organizations impact people, through their products and services as well, especially, we're in the Bay Area here at Berkeley, and have seen over the past year the impacts that, tech companies and growing impacts from automation and AI and other types of technologies, and making sure that and prioritizing, centering equity and inclusion within product development. Bias in AI and equitable and inclusive AI is another topic area for us at EGAL. But these are really important considerations as well. So I guess just a couple points there around some low-hanging fruit, but also advocating this as an opportunity to start really going after that higher up fruit, some of the deeper issues that I talked about in my presentation. And then again, really also making sure that we're thinking about the different touch points that companies have on people's lives, including through products and services, is important to think about. So just some initial thoughts.
That's really great, Genevieve. Thank you. And it'll align with what I wanted to follow up with Malcolm on too, around inclusion in products and services, which is a perfect segue from what you just said too. And I just read, now that you're with Better as well, over the weekend, not related to Better, but I read an article about a Black homeowner who had a white friend be there for an appraisal on their home value, and suddenly their home value shot up again. How much bias is completely embedded. And you and I have a friend, Malcolm Andre Perry, who's written a lot about Black homeownership. But so as someone, Glenn, in your position, who's worked directly with companies and organizations looking to expand accessibility of their products to marginalized communities, what role does empowering BIPOC and women in the workplace play in the creation of these products and services? How important is that from entry level on up to decision making on which products or services launch, to make sure we're doing this with meaning and not just with words?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to touch on the story that you saw, that I also saw this past weekend, I think there are two fantastic books that really interrogate just the widespread discrimination that goes on in the housing space. One is by our mutual friend, Andre Perry. It's called Know Your Price. And another is by Dr. Richard Rothstein, and it's called The Color of Law. And so many of these systems, housing just one among them, are systems that are built on discriminatory foundations. And as I was reading both of those works over the last couple of months, what I realized is, I've worked in the tech space, and engineers will oftentimes say something to the effect of, this is a feature, not a bug. And when I look at so many systems, again, just thinking about housing, because you brought up the point, so many of those systems are intentionally discriminatory. They intentionally marginalize women and people of color. And so that's why I was so excited when I saw Genevieve and her team's playbook that specifically spoke to embedding equity and inclusion into products and services. And so to kind of get to brass tacks, to answer the question, the role that empowering women and people of color has to play in the workplace today is those people need to be taking the leadership role on the teams that are creating these products. I think a lot about how DEI work oftentimes thinks about the numbers within an organization. How many women do we have? How many people of color we have? That's important, but what really matters is making sure that women, people of color, are the engineers, the designers, the marketers within an organization, and not just people on the teams, but people with actual decision-making power. When they're in positions to actually move the strategy of how a company works, you start to see the embedding of equity and inclusion into products and services. And again, going back to that earlier point, so that you're judging companies not strictly by the numbers of people they have in an organization, but based on the outcome that they're making in communities. And I think that's actually how we should be judging companies. I think a little bit about my own time in the tech world. When I was at Uber, I did a lot of work regarding making our platform more accessible and inclusive. And just to give you an example of how that sort of notion of inclusive design and empowering marginalized communities plays a role, I spent a lot of time working with the disability community. And one of the consistent phrases I heard from folks in that community was, "Nothing about us without us." And that really resonated with me. And that was really to say that when you have people who are of a community working to create solutions to benefit that community, you're much more likely to do so in a way that's thoughtful, inclusive, and again, ultimately better for the customers. And to Kim's point, if the customers are more are increasingly judging companies based on how much their actions match their values, that seems to me like a win-win-win. So in the context of the example at Uber, that meant, not just investing in, say, getting wheelchair accessible vehicles on the road, but also really getting concrete feedback from both advocates and employees with disabilities about which types of vehicles, locations, operational issues, and things like that. So again, it really comes back to this notion of inclusive design, which is to say that a company's DEI work and its product or external output work shouldn't be different. They shouldn't be siloed. They, in fact, need to be working based on the same strategy and the same playbook. And women and people of color need to be in positions of leadership. And those teams all need to be deeply intertwined. And I think only when that starts to happen in a meaningful way, and we're a long way from that being a meaningful part of how most businesses operate, I think that's the time when we'll really start to see progress made in terms of letting people who are oftentimes not a part of these conversations shape the future of what more equitable products and services will ultimately look like.
Yeah, really well said. And I'll remind our audience that if you have any questions for our two fantastic panelists tonight, please do place them down in the Q&A. We'll be getting to public questions here in just a minute or so. I'm going to actually pose this to both of you then, based on what you just said. And some of it is because of our own work too. We recently released a report on the power gap, which is different than, Genevieve's been looking at Fortune 100 and consulting and working with Fortune 500, as have you, Malcolm. In this work, we actually looked at the nation's top research institutions, the known as the 130 R1 universities that are leading research around the power and pay gaps and where women and people of color are in our nations. And, shocking surprise alert to you both, but turns out people of color and women are not represented equally, and we're nowhere near parity in our most prestigious educational institutions in the nation. So I think part of this is, and a lot of times we hear from employers that they're running regular, some of the things that we recommend at AAUW around parity in leadership and pay is running regular audits, more regular performance evaluations of hiring managers to make sure in searches that they're being more inclusive, and a lot of the things that can check the box around representation. But to Malcolm's point, representation isn't all of it, obviously. That's just to check the box of where your employees are from entry level to senior leadership level. So, practically speaking here, and Malcolm, you just gave up a really, really great example at Uber of involving people in the disability community to make sure that their needs are met, and we're really solving the problems and making Uber more accessible. But let's talk a little further into either one of you how, unless we have policy making in place that insists upon it, whether it's around transparency of data and data collection among private or publicly held companies, but how do we ensure that women and people of color are absolutely given a seat at the table and empowered as active participants in business decisions that shape the organizations they work for? So that's the internal work and the products and services they're outputting it. What are some things, and maybe you can point, Genevieve, if you'd like, to any one of the plays in the playbook, and Malcolm, I'd love you to weigh in too, because I think we know that's the what we need, but how do we get there to ensure that businesses are giving us more than lip service?
Yeah, well, I can start with this, and I think it's definitely really important. I'm glad you brought up the power gap and thinking about kind of power and pay gaps. And maybe just before getting to your specific question, I think that notion in particular is a really important for thinking about kind of how we have seen the deepening disparities that we see today with women and people of color, and that the average ratio of CEO pay to median worker pay in the U.S. is 278 to 1, and over the past 40 years, CEO pay has grown by 900%, while worker pay has grown by 12%. And actually, in that time, Black men have seen their wages decrease by 2%. So, again, considering the gender and racial makeup of CEOs at companies, you can imagine, more money for CEOs most often results in more money for white male leaders. And so, just some context around thinking about that power gap and women and POCs being nowhere near equality. I think that oftentimes when we think about the gender pay gap, you hear that 80 cents to the dollar figure, and that is really more of a reflection around most of the amount of that kind of pay gap is associated with more women working part-time, working in lower level positions. So it's really taking the average of women working with men working, and it takes into consideration that 80% doesn't include how it's not that women are making 80 cents to the dollar of the equivalent or same job as men. It takes into consideration all these other factors that exist. So I think, as mentioned before, it's not just about representation. It's about where women and people of color are within an organization, and more often than not, it's not within these places of power. I do think that we need policies. California has policies around women on boards and people of color on boards, and I think that is, we're seeing more kind of research starting to unfold around that, and I think that is an important role to play. Going back to equitable and inclusive products, I actually think that the growing demand and priority for equitable and inclusive products is also kind of heightening demand for having more diversity of workers at different levels and in different types of roles. As Malcolm mentioned, to have more equitable and inclusive products, we need women who are in engineering positions and people of color in engineering positions in leading these different teams. And so it's making more, it's exacerbating and quickening the need for having women and people of color in these different types of positions. So I think demanding more equitable and inclusive products is important because that has downstream effects on folks within the workplace. And there is an important role for policy as well within thinking about boards as well. So I guess those are just some initial thoughts, but curious about Malcolm's perspectives here too.
Yeah, Malcolm, weigh in.
Sure. And, I would concur with so much of what Genevieve said. And the way I think about this is we need to figure out levers that we can pull to put more women and people of color in positions of leadership. I have a sneaking suspicion that if CEOs were more representative of the population at large, obviously you'd have more of the wealth that Genevieve talked about going to women and people of color. But there's also a lot of literature that shows that disparities across all groups are smaller when you have women, and particularly when you have women of color in positions of leadership. So, at worst, if we had ways to actually just get folks who look like us in charge of some of these businesses, we'd have more of them reaping the benefits of that leadership. But in reality, we'd also probably have more equitable leadership strategies at the end of the day. And I think the same folks we've talked about who are in positions of power and influence in terms of pushing companies to make their products and services more inclusive are the same folks who have a really important position to play in terms of making sure that these folks are in positions of leadership. I made this point again, but I just think it's worth reiterating. Too often we judge the success of a business's diversity and inclusion efforts based on how many employees they have of a specific group. And I just think that's so fundamentally flawed because we so infrequently hold them to account related to how many women or say people of color are actually in positions of influence, leadership, and real empowerment. The window dressing, the diversity theater of hiring people who are oftentimes underrepresented, but not giving them the agency to actually make change. the business community is littered with those examples. And every single time a woman is hired for a token position, or a person of color is hired and then not given the tools to actually succeed, it really, I think, frustrates the exceptionally qualified women and people of color who can actually do really good in these companies. And so, in the same way that advocates and policymakers, employees, and as you said so wonderfully, Kim, customers can push companies towards greater accountability around their public statements, they have that same responsibility to push companies towards real change when it comes to leadership. Because I think the reality, if you can just really boil it down to something, is this: if we had more women, if we had more people of color, women of color, in these senior positions of leadership, we wouldn't be talking about those obscene inequalities that Genevieve has pointed to. And I don't think we would be having these existential issues with how capitalism is exacerbating inequalities. And I think we could make a lot of progress in this space without sacrificing so much of the innovation that is good that comes from the private sector, because you also see studies that show that more diverse teams actually are more innovative in terms of their output. So it is a challenge, but I think if you could just sort of boil it down to one tactic, it would be get women of color, people of color in positions of leadership, and call out the diversity theater when you see it for what it is, and continue to hold those companies accountable to actually give agency to the people who oftentimes have not had agency in these companies.
Yeah, well said. I just would add on that, it's a lot of what we talk about here too, because you're right. When you look at the whole number, you're like, oh, we have 50%, we're 60% women, and we have 40% people of color, but they're not in those. It's that power gap at the top of where the real decisions are made. And so it's much more than just where your hiring rates are on a given moment in time when you run a lens. It's also where your attrition and retention rates are, and where those promotion practices are of who's in charge at various levels within an organization. You're totally right. And one more thing I'd add, there's tomes and tomes of research on all of that. They work more productively. And guess what? The bottom line is enhanced when we have more people that are representative of our demography and of different backgrounds making decisions on behalf of organizations and companies, because we get it right more often than we don't. Genevieve, you were about to come in. Please go ahead.
I was just going to add something that we delve into in our playbook that Malcolm made me think about is, a lot of this comes down to power and a need to kind of shift power dynamics, and how a lot of the priorities and perspectives of just the few individuals leading corporate boards, who tend to be male and white, are really dictating business structures and lead to major impacts for so many people. We need systemic changes for how leadership supports and manages workers, and that also requires an altering around who gets to say in these decisions, beyond the pandemic. So increasing diversity in boards is really important. But one thing that we talk about is actually co-determination models, which is perhaps a huge shift in thinking, but it's around referring to models of corporate governance where workers have voting power to determine board leadership. And by providing employees with a voice in how the company operates, workers of color and female workers are more likely to have their views heard and needs met. And this is happening. Other countries like Germany has instituted co-determination models, and they have found that they have lower unemployment, higher investments in R&D, and they've kind of done better during financial crises in the 90s. So part of it is also, what are some other things that we haven't thought about in terms of shifting some of these dynamics, and not just, hiring, a token women or person of color for a board, but actually, are there larger systemic changes that we can think about, and how can we take this as an opportunity to think about some of these larger systemic changes to really address and go back to those kind of power dynamics and representation that's meaningful.
Yeah, great points, Genevieve. Thank you so much. I know we're going to be running out of time here, and I honestly could be talking with you too for about the next 5 hours on this. And I think among us, first of all, I'd benefit so much from your counsel, from you both, that we could solve a lot of this. And let's just hope there's business leaders also leaning in on these areas. We do have a pretty interesting question in the Q&A box that I want to address, and it's one that I hear a lot out in the communities around, and it's that, the idea that, of course, BIPOC and women need to be on the team, but also have decision-making power around the entire business, including projects and services. But the question here is, how do you explain the importance of equity and inclusivity to a person with a lacking mindset? Meaning, if, in the example she has in quotes is, if I write a program that includes BIPOC, how will I as a white person be affected? And I always look at this as, the pie thing. There's plenty of pie. You're going to get a slice of pie. I'm going to get a slice. There's plenty of pie. The pie's not going to be given out entirely, and you're going to miss out on your piece of pie with bolstering of inclusivity in all of society. But how, if you really are dealing with a baseline of having to get to 101 level of understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how do you explain it? And either one of you can jump in here.
Sure, I'm happy to take the first stab. I love that question, and because I spent a lot of time, particularly over the last year, fielding questions from folks who say, I'm struggling with this notion of allyship, and there are all these conversations around what it's like to be a woman or a person of color in the workforce, and I, as a white man, for example, am struggling to figure out, what do I do, and what does this mean for me? I think there are two great points. One, Kim already made, which is, there is not a finite amount of opportunity. In fact, improving the pool of opportunities for people who are historically left out means that we'll make better solutions, we'll be more innovative, we will create more equitable systems that will be better for society as a whole. And so let's disregard that notion, which I think is so well put, that we have an infinite pie. And then we have a finite pie, excuse me. And then the second point is, it's not about whether a person is a woman or a person of color. It is about who in the workforce, and quite frankly, in all of society, has privilege in positions of power. In a world where the dynamic were completely switched and people of color were the people in positions of wide-scale privilege, then we'd be having the sort of opposite conversation. But the reality is, in almost every setting, it is disproportionately men, and disproportionately men who are white, who are in positions of privilege and power. And so when you think about any sort of power dynamic in any context, there is a responsibility, I believe, of the entities, people, institutions in those positions of power to leverage their power to help people who otherwise wouldn't have that power. And that can be different in different situations. I have been in situations as a person of color where I have been in a power dynamic. Maybe it's because of my gender. And I think there's a responsibility that I have when I'm in those situations to use that power and privilege to help give an opportunity to people who don't have it because of some demographic characteristic or identity trait that leaves them out. And so it's not always an easy conversation, I think, to have with people who need that 101 grounding for why this work is so important, but sometimes centering it less on what your gender is, less on what your race or ethnicity or identity is, and more on what privilege a person has in an institution can sometimes help them understand, oh my gosh, there's a lot I can do in, say, and opportunities I have that someone else doesn't have. Maybe there's an opportunity for me to help someone else get to where I am.
Very well said. Thank you. Genevieve, your thoughts?
Yeah, to build off that, I love that you brought up privilege, because that's actually exactly what I was thinking about as well. And so at EGAL, we talk about kind of equity fluent leadership, and it always starts with understanding your own lived experiences and the values of other lived experiences. And I think one way to kind of connect with people is to think about, how do you reflect on your own kind of privileges and experiences? And sometimes people can, I think, bristle a bit at the word privilege, but it's about kind of reflecting on recognizing that we all have kind of things outside of our control that have put us in a certain position, and acknowledging that sometimes those can be related to gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, nationality. There's so many different aspects that can affect our privilege and our power, and we all come from these different kind of perspectives and lived experiences. And I think actually having folks connect around that, and I've done different kind of trainings and sessions of having folks connect around that, it really helps open people's eyes to understanding this kind of interplay. So I think that's a really important place to start.
That's great. Well, thank you both so much. I know we're running out of time here, so I want to give a couple of quick reminders here. One, this webinar has been taped, and so if you missed the first few minutes, or want to refresh and hear more from Malcolm and Genevieve as you reflect on this evening's webinar, it will be on our website in the next 2 to 3 days. Furthermore, the playbook from the center, Genevieve, the EGAL Center that Berkeley Haas has produced, thanks to Genevieve's really strong and important research and analysis, we will send out with the evaluation form, so you will be receiving the link as well, and we will send that to all registered parties to it. And I should also note that AAUW, for our AAUW members, we do have a diversity, equity, and inclusion toolkit available to all on our website, free, with a lot of readings, understandings, ideas, and programs that you can share among your affiliates, with your family members over coffee or a dinner, and have some deeper conversations on these issues about how you're representing. It's not just about the for-profit sector. It's not just about the private sector, government, the nonprofit sector in which I work. It's really on how all of us are going to lead equitable recovery for our society, of which we're all human beings and a part of. And so we all have those roles we can play together. But I especially also want to thank Berkeley Haas School for your support of our webinar series, for enlightening us with your new research, to Malcolm Glenn for joining us while you're on the road to share your wisdom and thoughts and key best practices for us all and moving forward. Would love to reconnect with you both in the coming month or so, because I think things are going to start moving quickly here, and we want to make sure that we're moving the ball down the field in ways that are going to help people to thrive in a new rebuilt economy, and really look forward to engaging with you both more and more. To all of you for joining us today, thank you so much, and do look forward to future webinars coming in the coming weeks. And please do pay attention and do share any of your feedback with my wonderful colleague, Nikia McFarlane, at her email address right here on the screen, and more to come. But Genevieve and Malcolm, you've given us so much food for thought and wisdom tonight. Thank you both so much for being with us, and everybody have a great night. Good night.
Thanks.